Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce Julia Haas to you. Julia Haas is an international law and human rights expert. In her work, she has focused on international relations, the intersection of technology and human rights, and the prevention of marginalization. She particularly focuses on policy research and development in the field of internet governance and digital participation, leading the project on the impact of artificial intelligence on freedom of expression and working on digital safety of women journalists at the office of the OSCE. That's one of the interesting parts. And in particular, there at the office of the representative on freedom of the media. Previously, she worked as a legal officer and human rights advisor at the Austrian Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs. And she sits on the advisory board for the Vienna Forum for Democracy and Human Rights, holds a master's degree in law from the University of Vienna. So she's an alumna of our faculty. She holds, in addition to this, an LLM and Master of Laws from the University of Vienna in Information and Media Law. And she's a candidate, a PhD candidate on the impact of digital innovations on media freedom. So she's probably one of the most qualified people in this country when we talk about artificial intelligence and platform moderation and content moderation during a pandemic. But there's also a very precise moment now why we are talking, because she wrote her master thesis, her LLM thesis on the topic. In particular, she wrote about a treatment for viral deception, automated moderation of COVID-19 disinformation. So the other reason, in addition to her expertise in general, is her specific expertise in the domain of COVID-19 related disinformation. Julia, so good to have you here. What is the major outcome of your thesis in 3 minutes, if this is possible at all?
Hello, good evening also from my side. Many thanks for having me. So indeed, I have just finalized my LLM master thesis on COVID-19 online disinformation. And of course, it's difficult to summarize it in a couple of minutes, but I would say that kind of starting from looking at how content is curated, moderated, and really kind of like spreads online, the way also information is accessed and received and shared in today's kind of digital age via platforms. There is an impact, of course, on the rights to freedom of opinion, to freedom of information, to freedom of expression. And if we look at disinformation and COVID-19 disinformation specifically, of course, it's a very, very interesting angle to look at how the online sphere and the digital ecosystem and the rules and the policies of the platforms kind of relate to this phenomenon of disinformation. And I would say that the main findings, and I'm sure we will go into more detail on how online content governance, I say content governance kind of as an umbrella term for content moderation. So the question of how information is filtered or kind of automation is used to detect and filter out or act upon specific content, and content curation, which is the second kind of side of the same coin, looking at how the vast amounts of information, ideas, and content online is sorted, ranked, promoted, and demoted. So all of this I refer to when I speak about content governance. And there, when we look at disinformation, it of course interrelates to all of these different levels. And in my thesis, I look at how the policies and the use of automation to implement the policies by the platforms impact on the spread of disinformation, but also the moderation of disinformation. And the outcomes, the findings of the thesis are very much looking at the responses by states and platforms. And in short, the main finding is that the responses by states have been partly problematic from a human rights perspective, but also the responses and measures that the platforms themselves undertook have been inadequate to a certain degree, but also have been very diverging to how they acted previously. So it's kind of a turning point on how they govern content online. And then kind of the underlying or main outcome, I would say, is that I conclude kind of by saying there is, regardless of how many mitigation measures there are to the challenges of online disinformation, as long as the digital ecosystem looks as it looks today, where we have like a few very dominant platforms that determine which content is promoted, which content is taken down, and they use automation, which is error prone and might be biased and is not reliable in the sense of really differentiating between information, in particular when we speak about disinformation, that we need to kind of change the design of this underlying rules, so that there is really an underlying need to address the socio-technical context of how information online spreads is curated, and that means that we need to kind of redefine the business models and business practices that are very profit oriented, data harvesting oriented, advertising oriented. And if we really want to address online disinformation, in particular now also, of course, with this COVID factor, then we need to get to the roots kind of and to this underlying need to really addressing the business practices and business models.
Mm-hmm. And how would you do this? I mean, addressing, do you mean writing academic papers about the business models, or would you, or providing laws? And if so, on which level?
Yeah, I mean, as always, of course, a complex issue kind of requires complex responses too. So I think we would need to look at the content moderation curation at one side and the use of automation for it. And there are already a lot of measures have been identified that would really help to mitigate the risks and the challenges. Speaking about transparency, speaking about accountability, redress mechanism, human rights impact assessments, there's a long list of things that has also already been identified as being potentially useful and as addressing the challenges. Then, of course, if we speak about addressing disinformation, we also have to look at the complex responses needed to the different layers of disinformation, because some information might be misleading, some information might be state-led, some information, disinformation might be like inciting to violence or discrimination. So again, here we will need different responses. Some will require regulatory responses, yes, but of course the broader range of disinformation, not especially from a human rights perspective. And then the third big pillar, I would say, in this conversation is really how much kind of margins of appreciation a few private actors should have when we speak about how they shape and arbitrate our information space.
Meaning what exactly? I didn't understand the end, I think, exactly. Do you mean that Facebook and Google and YouTube and the others should be even more in focus than they are at the moment?
I mean that there should be some kind of regulatory framework of how far they can decide about certain things themselves. But here, referring back to your question on which level, of course, this is nothing that can be solved on the national level, because I mean, the information space is arguably even one today, one global. And if we look at this very dominant and powerful internet intermediaries or platforms, also the ones you just mentioned, they of course act on a global scale. So the responses, of course, also need to be multilateral and also multi-stakeholder.
Yeah, so if I understand that correctly, you mean that something like the DSA or the DMA are a nice first attempt, but they will not suffice, right? It needs more of global approaches.
Yes. I mean, of course, regional approaches such as the DSA and DMA are, of course, way better and rather able to also address the challenges than only a national law. And I think that we have seen also when we look back at, for example, data protection, that also legislation by the European Union, even though it is kind of limited in scope, it can have an influence on the global scale. And if you have a market like the European Union market, with 5 million potential users or individuals being affected by it, then of course the
500 million, sorry, not 5 million. Yeah, 500.
Thanks for the correction. Yes, 500. Then of course the companies might also change their policies just in principle, thereby also benefiting the remaining people who use it outside of the European Union.
Yeah. And do you think then, I mean, one of my remarks on the situation at the moment would be that I see, and you also said this before, that the platforms have changed their policy quite significantly because of COVID. And we see quite dramatic changes in the sense of that they are actively, at least in my view, they are actively not only prioritizing things, but also moderating and with all caution, I say censoring, although I know, of course, that this is a very problematic term, censoring content, much different than they did before, although there is not yet such a global hard law rule that you might think about when you are arguing that we should put them more into focus. So do you think that what we see here by COVID is now something which will develop on its own regulatory attempts, which will finally lead into a situation that is better than the one that we have at the moment, hopefully? Or do you think that this is something which needs attention of any of the global bodies that one might think of that could take care of this?
I would probably say all of the above, because I mean, I think it's two different sides, because we have seen this shift in how they moderate and curate content, even though there is no regulatory push, even though you could also argue that the pressure also from governments to react to online disinformation has increased, of course, also during the pandemic, because we have just seen that the risks that disinformation has on individual and public health has been very obvious, of course, in this pandemic. So there was an increasing pressure on platforms to act upon this disinformation. But I would say that their reactions and their kind of like shift in how they act and react and what they promote and how proactive they are has gone beyond this pressure. So there was also something, be it like out of business interest or maybe altruistic or whatever, but the platforms have really changed their way of governing content from already several years on, I would argue, but really like extremely accelerating these trends in the last 1.5 years since the pandemic. And here I think that it is clear, like also if you look at the discussion and how the platforms presented themselves only a couple of years ago, they were very reluctant in saying that they even have a role to play, right, in the dissemination of information. They would declare themselves as being mere conduits of information, and they have been becoming more and more active, I would say. And now in the last 1.5 years, they have taken on even more kind of like media-like functions, because they're really proactively provided links to health authorities, to the WHO. They have really sorted information in a way more kind of extreme way than they did before. And they also have publicly stated that they do have a role to play. So this is a very interesting, I think, development. And this is kind of paired with the increasing pressure by states, but also by the public, I would say, that there is really a need for them to kind of stand up against disinformation. And the regularly kind of responses or consequences out of this are, I think, also potentially accelerated because they're doing more by themselves. And we can also see that some of the content is actually being removed and that it might be positive or negative. So this might also even more bring governments to their willingness to produce new law or regulations around it. And I think also we see this, of course, now in the European context, where in addition to the DSA and the DMA, there are also other more like co-regulatory or self-regulatory approaches, like the Code of Conduct Against Disinformation, where, of course, also there has been a push over the last 1.5 years. So I think there are really different layers to it, and they are all interrelated. So they all influence one another, and the more platforms do, the more governments might also ask them to do, or see that it's possible to also shift responsibilities to them, which also is not always something which also entails its own challenges, when kind of like responsibilities are outsourced, because sometimes it's also kind of bypassing the safeguards that we have just in a rule of law procedure. But of course, I would say also the public kind of understanding of the role of platforms to address disinformation has shifted a lot in the last 1.5 or 2 years by now almost.
Yeah. Would you agree with me that COVID is one important part of the picture and the other one is the deplatforming of Trump?
I would say that has clearly shifted the conversation. And you could see that a lot of people who were maybe not that much into discussing the policies or even like thinking about it also found themselves arguing about has this been right or not, and thereby I think that this conversation, regardless of to which conclusion you come, because there are very strong arguments for kind of both sides, but a lot of people came to realize that the sheer kind of power and dominance these platforms have. And I think that this is an important step in development also when we talk about we need more transparency and just like literacy and understanding of how our information space works and functions today.
Transparency is a key point. You mentioned that several times now, and I think it's interesting because when we are talking about transparency in the public sector, that's easy in a sense. Not in Austria, by the way, because we have a long story of talking about transparency without being transparent. But it's still relatively easy. When it comes to the private sector, it's not that easy because the typical argument, of course, obviously is that everything that asks for transparency goes potentially into business secrecy and is in conflict with business secrecy, which might lead to conflicts of fundamental rights, obviously, right? So freedom of information on the one hand, property protection on the other would be the most obvious one of those conflicts. So how should we deal with, and then there's on top of this, there's also obviously the fundamental rights of the general public. I mean, there are three players at the table here. So how do you think that we can steer this debate in Austria first, in Europe second, and globally third?
I mean, I think as always, and this is kind of the response from the human rights perspective, we need to find the proportionality within it, right? So of course, there is the valid point by private companies to say they have their business secrecy. Also, when we speak about like a lot of transparency, we also have the data protection aspect. But there are several possibilities as also, I mean, I don't think people or advocates or international organizations that call for more transparency mean that the platform should kind of like just lay open everything or lay open the detailed code of their automation, because this would of course be something that's also just from an economic interest very valuable. But there can be a tiered approach. There can be like transparency that is needed for users of these services to say they should be able to be empowered to have user agency. They should be able to know which policies affect them, where automation is involved, and how it is determined with what content they are targeted at what time. So this is like one level of transparency that I don't think could be argued away with the business secrecy argument. And then there could be like a second layer of transparency, for example, for regulators or for an independent social media council, which has also been proposed by some, and they could, for example, receive more information also on details like the use of automation, how their codes are being designed, how they're being produced, which data sets feed into it. Because we know from several studies, and currently because of this lack of access to data and to the information, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible in some instances, to assess or to even know where automation is used, and to assess how this automation has been developed, how it has been designed, and to which degree it is used, how much human involvement or human overview is still involved. And all of this information is needed to assess the potential impact, the potential discriminatory impacts, the biases that might be involved. And it, of course, doesn't need to be like everything fully transparent and out in the open, but there needs to be some kind of democratic public oversight overview. And this is transparency. This is what the complexity of transparency that kind of I refer to, but also a lot of different also papers and organizations and civil society organizations refer to, that there needs to be in the end, like transparency is the foundation of really the scrutiny we need, the public oversight, and in the end also, of course, like accountability, and just having kind of checks and balances in place as we ask for pretty much everything in a democratic context.
Yeah, let me come back to the transparency once again, because I would argue that at least two other fields of the law, consumer protection and data protection, both of them have as a common root that there should be more transparency in their domain, right? And both of them, in my view at least, and I want to provoke you a little bit here now, both of them failed dramatically because both of them led into a situation where consumers or data subjects are shot by sheer amounts of, unnecessary information under the presumption that that might be transparency related information. And at the same time, nobody really reads this, nobody cares about it. And we are clicking away everything all the time because it's annoying us and distracting us. So why should that be that different in your domain now? Because let me put it like this. I know perfectly well that when I'm looking into my Twitter feed, this looks very different from yours, and in particular, very different from those who are of a fundamentally different opinion when it comes to COVID-related issues than I am. I know this already. What would it change now if I were informed in every single tweet now, listen, this was selected because you were clicking on this or you are interested in that? Would that really change anything? Or don't you think that it would lead again in the same situation? We would end up in the same situation, just like in consumer and data protection, which is not really a success story in my view?
No, I mean, it's a very valid point. And I think there are several kind of aspects to unpack there, because I mean, of course you were well aware of it, but that doesn't mean that everybody is well aware of it as a first point. And the second, I think what we always have to keep in mind when we speak about transparency is that transparency is only a means, but never the end goal, right? So transparency should be leading to more accountability, oversight, and a strengthening of human rights. Unfortunately, I kind of agree with you that, especially when we look at the data protection, that the focus on only procedural safeguards and transparency has not been sufficient. And here I would kind of like draw the link and say also, when we speak about content governance by private actors that are so powerful that they really impact kind of information per se and information spaces, and if they use automation for it, then transparency alone can of course not solve it, but transparency needs to be part of a broader kind of like accountability framework, and the transparency should not be in the sense of like you consent to something, and it can only be to a certain degree. But I fully agree, and this is something I also state, for example, in my thesis, that there needs to be kind of like some red lines, so some issues that would need to be identified that cannot be solved merely with consent or knowledge or transparency. And this, I think, is particularly important also when we speak about human rights, because they are always focusing on the individual, right? But we know that many of these challenges we talk about, including disinformation and online information, they have the potential to harm collectively. Maybe not an individual person because of an individual tweet, but they may really disown kind of trust in democratic processes, in independent media and institutions. So there is also this additional layer that I think needs to be addressed, which cannot be addressed by providing individual users of a platform with transparency or with the possibility to redress, because it's also always about the costs involved and the resources involved. And when we speak about we want to empower users, then it needs to go beyond. So I would say transparency is crucial, but it's not sufficient in itself.
Yeah, you said at the beginning that you were not that content about what states did so far, and that states did not really perform very well when it comes to how to deal with this online disinformation issue in COVID-related matters. I would like to ask you whether you think that this is also the case because transparency is not really a priority at the moment when it comes to legislative actions, such as the Austrian law on communication platforms, Kommunikationsplattformengesetz, or the German network enforcement law, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. I don't see too much about transparency there, but I see a lot of notice and take down in rather short periods. Would you agree with me that this is perhaps one of the arguments why one could not be that happy about how states worked on the situation, or would you put the perspective differently?
I would put the focus on, or I would say the main challenge is if we kind of limit also the regulatory discussions around content. And this is what the Kommunikationsplattformengesetz and the NetzDG do quite much with this notice and takedown procedures that, of course, yes, they speak about procedures, but they always focus on a specific individual illegal content and platforms need to act about. And I think that what we see increasingly also, for example, with the legislative proposals in the European context, that there's kind of a shift towards more like duty of care or more this really transparency, accountability frameworks and risks assessment and risk mitigation measures, which I think are just way more sustainable. They're way more human rights friendly than focusing on specific content. And in particular, I think when we speak about disinformation and not precisely about illegal content as the NetzDG or the Kommunikationsplattform, it even adds an additional layer of complexity because disinformation very often, of course, doesn't fall within this category, but still needs to be addressed just in different ways. And then, of course, just one additional sentence here that also a lot of countries or regions have introduced since COVID new legislation really focusing on disinformation. And there, I think this response by states has been particularly problematic because they very often base terminology on very vague concepts or even say disinformation is content that is false, which also raises a lot of questions just from our rule of law perspective, but also open, of course, the door for misuse and arbitrariness, which is very problematic for democratic discourse, for dissidents, for having a conversation also about the health measures that have been adopted, how successful they were, and of course, detrimental from a human rights perspective.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point in my view, because one of the main stories that I read when I read about complaints of people who are, let's put it like this, critical against what's happening in the policy field when it comes to COVID-19, many of those people argue that they are not allowed to freely share their opinion, that they are censored, that YouTube and others don't let them explain what they think that the truth is telling them, or makes them to tell. And this, of course, is a problematic argument in a discourse which is about what is scientifically proven, what is debatable, and what is clearly wrong, right? You can't argue with someone who's constantly arguing that he or she can't tell you what he thinks because he's deleted from the network. That's a problem in this whole COVID-19 disinformation debate, in my view. And interestingly, in my view at least, the major platforms such as YouTube are seen as part of the problem by those deniers, right? So they are constantly arguing YouTube is censoring us. So YouTube has, in a way, the issue that the state tells them that they are not monitoring enough, and at the same time, the minorities affected by this monitoring tell them that they are censoring them, and it's very difficult to navigate through this, in my view. And the outcome of this is that there are alternative platforms rising, such as Telegram or Vimeo, or all the others, you know them better than I do, which are not really easy to regulate because you can't access them as state authority. In some cases, you do not even know who is behind this. And do you think that there is this threat of escape, so that we are just going in this debate, which is not really new, by the way, it goes back to the 70s, this escape of digital sovereignty just in the next stage then, and we end up in just less enforceability at the very end?
I mean, yes, it's a risk, but also I don't think it's the biggest concern in this very complex discussion, because I mean, the problem of people who, while using those services, accusing those services of not being able to speak out, or in general complaining about a lack of freedom while using their freedom of expression, is of course a very complex challenge that I would say is even like on a societal level and cannot be resolved in this conversation. But of course, if content is removed, and this again kind of links back to why I think a mere focus on content and which content is problematic or which content needs to be removed is not productive, potentially counterproductive even, because if a content of such a person that you're just mentioning, for example, is removed, that might also be understood as kind of like a proof of that they're being silenced, or even like a badge of honor or something. And if this can thereby contribute to pushing those people into either alternative platforms, or also even more in polarizing, radicalizing filter bubbles or kind of echo chambers. And if that leads to them leaving platforms and services that have at least a limited and minimum amount and level of reachability, transparency, and at least a connect still to the public debate, where also other views are still kind of part of the discourse, at least in the broader sense, even if it doesn't reach the individual, then of course it is a problem if it pushes it out. But at the same time, I don't think that this risk alone could should lead to a situation where we say, okay, that means we shouldn't address this content or we shouldn't remove it. It just means that we have to pay additional attention to also new emerging platforms, that we need to be open, and that we really need to find ways where the digital sphere has some kind of general rules and frameworks that ideally could, of course, be enforced everywhere. But that is a little bit, of course, to a certain degree, also wishful thinking, because there will always be new kind of platforms and layers. But also, all of these services can, to a certain degree, be pressured or be tried to be reached. And just because you mentioned Telegram now, of course, there's also this discussion with taking this question of moderation, or like the rules that they apply, to the next level when we speak about app stores, or like if they don't apply specific rules, and if they're not reachable for regulators, for the government, for the public, and if they don't have any redress, accountability, transparency, maybe they should not be allowed to be such a service. Then we come to the next level where we say, okay, and who decides whether they're allowed and not, which kind of links back to the question of who has that kind of power to decide upon, in the end, the information space. And if it's then again, like in the app stores of Apple, Google, whatever, it kind of only entrenches more their power.
Indeed, yeah.
But at the same time, I think that in 2021 and now almost 2022, we know that public discourse and private communication takes place mainly online. And these platforms are not a media, like legacy media, of course, but they're also not a platform where they have no influence, because their policies and their architecture even shapes how information is possible to take place. Therefore, I think, as there are somewhere in between, it is very valid to just say, okay, there is also a set of rules, a set of kind of frameworks and pillars that need to be in place for such a platform to be able to provide such a service, such as with many other sectors and economic sectors also. There are specific rules in place. So I think the question is how to enforce this, as you mentioned before. But I don't think that we're even at this point of discussion in the public discourse yet.
It's interesting that you use the term architecture, which is borrowed by Lawrence Lessig from 1999 about code and other laws of cyberspace. So that's one of the starting points of the debate, I think. And also very interesting for me that you are mentioning here so clearly that there might be a meta level of regulation now regulating the platforms that regulate platforms, right? Ending up again in a duopoly because it's either Google then or Apple. And that's a very, very strange situation we are in, which obviously, again, triggers the question how transnational organizations such as the United Nations or the OSCE, just to mention that now again, how they find their role in all this. And perhaps you could, Julia, explain to me, because I'm not really very familiar with this, how the OSCE behaves in all this and how the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media positions themselves in this debate. Is there any impact coming from there in the day-to-day political debate?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, we kind of started off with saying we need international and multilateral responses to these multilateral and global challenges. And I think that is very important that all the organizations and all different actors who also work on be it democracy, human rights, or security kind of play a role and also complementary address it. And that is also really the approach also by the OSCE, which I think has a very kind of interesting and different starting point, because the OSCE is a security organization and a dialogue cooperation organization. But at the same time, it recognized very early on that human rights are an integral part of this. And the Representative on Freedom of the Media, of course, is an autonomous institution within that framework. But that also means that we or the representative will look at the challenges to freedom of the media, the challenges to freedom of speech. And of course, if we refer now to COVID-19 disinformation, it has links to pretty much everything that the office has been working on over the years, like digital transformation, but also what we see increasingly like an anti-media sentiments. It's connected to safety of journalists, it's connected to plurality and freedom of expression. So of course, it's also something that is very, very valid to our kind of mandate and the role that the OSCE plays. But at the same time, I think we have a little bit of a different role than, for example, other international actors. I mean, the European Union, of course, with kind of the ability to produce hard law is a specific setting anyway. But the focus of the OSCE, I would say, is to really provide policy guidance through this dialogue. And this is something that we do regularly. So we have also a project focusing specifically on the impact of AI on freedom of expression, on which I work too. And here we really aim at providing states with guidance on how they should introduce and ensure free speech safeguards when they, for example, think about regulating AI or when they think of introducing other measures. And with this dialogue kind of focus that the OSCE has, we focus very much on also bringing good practice example, having this dialogue and providing this kind of platform of bringing together expertise, also academic expertise, and linking it to the policy making directly.
And does that work also in the sense that you are monitoring and trying to influence the debate on the AI regulation in Europe at the moment? And is there an opinion, an official opinion available of the OSCE on the regulation draft as we see it? Yeah,
I mean, preliminary, the OSCE is of course acting towards the participating states. So we are covering basically the Northern Hemisphere from North America to former Soviet Union and everything kind of in between. The European Union as such is not a participating state, but kind of a collective. We do very much, of course, monitor also what the EU does, and we are involved informally, but also formally in several like working groups and vice versa. But for example, what we often do with national legislation, that we also offer a legal review, or that we really also provide detailed kind of recommendations on how we think the freedom of the media and freedom of expression aspect could be strengthened within the specific law, is something that we wouldn't do with the European Union, just because it doesn't fit in the setup. But of course, we are part of the conversation, and we also include the European Union to a certain degree, of course, in the policy development that we do, because the main aim is, of course, to find global solutions. But for the AI Act, we do not have like an official public statement yet, but we, of course, monitor it closely and also try to bring in our perspective in the conversation at the EU.
Yeah, and your thesis is right at the edge of all this, right? I would expect that to be probably the most insightful paper at the moment available on this interplay. Julia, I think we managed to have a very, very good overview at the moment, but there's one remaining question which I would really love to hear from you an answer on, which is, no, two actually. The first one is whether you would like to comment on the Austrian specificities of the debate. So whether you see Austria in this game somewhere outstanding, and if so, why? That would be question one. And question two would be, as this pandemic is not going to disappear, unfortunately, in the next days, it would be very interesting to hear from you what you think how this will further develop, this debate on automated content moderation in this period that is coming now, where we might expect even more pressure from the pandemic on the one hand, and even more pressure from the minorities claiming that they are not a minority, claiming that they are censored, etc. Overheating the political debate on the other hand, and again with the platforms in the middle of this, needing to try to follow their business model, although both sides are developing pressure on them. So first Austria, second future.
Let me start with the second, maybe, yeah. if I may. I mean, I think that the crisis, as also previously other crises in other contexts, have acted kind of as an accelerator of many of the trends, and also the discussion and the conversation we are having. And I think that we have seen like a shift how platforms govern content. We have seen a shift towards more use of automation, and that was also caused in the beginning of the crisis just by like they also needed to send their staff home, right? Just for epidemiologic reasons. But often when you test something in a crisis, then it stays on, right? So I would also imagine that this shift that we have seen in the measures, responses that platforms take, that they will last. And to a certain degree, I would argue we can already see that, because quite recently, YouTube has announced that they will now have the same kind of policies they have for misleading COVID-19 vaccination disinformation. They will apply the same also to other vaccinations, because so far in the conversation we're having, we have really seen that COVID-19 related disinformation has been kind of dealt with in a silo. So all these different measures we have been discussing today have been deployed differently for COVID-19 information than for any other. And I think that we will see that this will be kind of like taking over. And there is certainly something kind of like challenging from a human rights perspective, because in a crisis, there is, of course, more flexibility or also a need to react differently. But if it's then just being accepted, without the safeguards, the human rights safeguards, because they are not kind of like built in from the beginning, then there is a risk. And that's also the same if like governments ask platforms to make the legal assessment of whether content is illegal or not. That might be tested in a specific crisis, be it following a terrorist attack or now in the context of the pandemic. But these kind of regulations tend to last. So I do think that this shift will be kind of like permanent or more towards permanent, but at the same time, this will also influence the regulatory discussion a lot, and thereby kind of potentially also this saying of "don't waste a good crisis" will be hopefully to a certain degree being valid, because I think that really also the public awareness and understanding of the role of those platforms, how much it impacts the information forming process of individuals and of societies, the impact of it has been way more discussed, way more seen. And I think that this is very crucial in the times we live in. And again, interrelates, of course, with regulatory processes. And towards Austria, I mean, of course, when you live in a specific country, you always tend to see there are some peculiarities or like some special situations. But for me, kind of like taking a step back from really working on this on a more kind of international or multilateral scene, I would not say that there is something like very particular that in Austria is different when we speak about content moderation or content governance. But I think that something that is really relevant for Austria also is to really engage in this finding a solution on a more regional or global level. And the Kommunikationsplatform Gesetz, for example, was like one step towards saying we do not want to wait anymore. We really want to address several of these challenges with its own, like for better or worse. But I think it's really crucial for especially a small country like Austria, where information is very, very important also from neighboring countries, where dialogue is very often also in the general kind of like German speaking area, that it's even more important to really have this kind of approach towards like beyond the borders and really trying to find solutions on a ideally global level.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what the future is going to bring us here. Julia, is there anything that you want to mention that I didn't ask about?
Maybe I just want to mention one thing that I thought about yesterday again, because I mean, as you probably, I mean, certainly know, this year the Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded to journalists, right, for the first time actually since the Second World War. And I think especially Maria Ressa, who is one of the laureates, has been continuously pointing out this interplay between platform power, information spaces, also disinformation, also really the gendered aspect that we haven't talked about today, but that of course is also very relevant in this context. And something she said in her lecture in Oslo when she received the prize summarizes, I think it's very nice, because she starts with saying information spaces kind of determines everything else in our world, because this is the starting point. And at the same time, she says, if we don't have trust and if we don't have facts, then we cannot have a shared reality. And a shared reality, of course, is the starting point for addressing any of the challenges we are facing these days, be it the pandemic or climate change or anything else. So I think this is a nice kind of like summarizing factor on the one hand, and at the same time also a motivator to really continue to address this issue and trying to find human rights safeguarding solutions to the very, very complex and challenging situation we are finding ourselves in. Yeah,
I completely agree with what you're saying. And trust is certainly one of the key terms that we are going to discuss quite intensely in 2022, I'm quite sure. Julia, it was a pleasure and an honor, and I learned really a lot from you, and I'm sure that our listeners did the same. Thank you so much for sharing your outcomes of the thesis, but also your thoughts on the matter in addition to the thesis with us. One very last question. Are you going to publish the thesis somewhere?
I do plan so, but I don't know where yet.
Okay,
but I will.
So let us know, please. Let us
Yes.
know when you're publishing this. I will be very interested to read it then again, although I read it obviously already, but to read it then again and also to share the news where you can buy this or where you can read this. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Stay healthy, stay interested, and stay connected with us. All the best. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.